Welcome to Timeless Dreams. Subscribe, relax, and drift into sleep with the gentle stories of history. Tonight, we drift back into the shadows of history, not the kind told in books or sung in ballads, but the kind whispered in alleyways and written in blood. Close your eyes. Feel the warmth of a quiet fire by your side. Let the gentle crackle soften your thoughts. Outside, it's a different world. Cold, dark, and dangerous. A place where survival isn't promised, and morality is a luxury few can afford. Welcome to the medieval underworld, a world of secrets, betrayal, and silent footsteps echoing through castle halls and cobbled streets. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that you weren't a farmer, a priest, or a merchant. You were an assassin. Not the sleek, noble kind from fantasy novels or polished video games, but a real assassin, living in a world without antibiotics, night vision, or second chances. A world where a single mistake meant torture, or worse, a forgotten grave beneath the mud. Visual command. Slow fade-in of a misty medieval street. A hooded figure blends into the shadows. Dim torchlight flickers off wet stone walls. You'd be employed by kings, bishops, or barons, men whose hands were too clean to hold the blade themselves. Your weapon? Often a dagger, small and silent. Your targets? Political rivals, traitors, or even innocent scapegoats. There were no clear rules, no formal training academies, just instincts and the will to live one more night. You didn't choose this life. You were either born into it, coerced, or desperate. Maybe your family had starved, and someone offered you coin, or perhaps revenge carved its way into your heart. Whatever the reason, you entered a game that had only one exit, and it rarely involved walking away. Visual command. Transition to a medieval banquet hall. Nobles laugh over wine. A shadowed figure observes from above, unseen. But here's the brutal truth. Being a medieval assassin was rarely about glory. It was about sickness, suspicion, and isolation. The tools of your trade were primitive. Poison was unreliable. Disguises were poor. Escape routes were few. And if you were caught, the punishments were horrifying. Drawn-out deaths designed to entertain crowds and send messages. Let's not romanticize it. You had to kill without leaving a trace. You had to blend in and vanish like smoke. And still, every job left a mark on your soul. There were no therapists, no confessions to ease your guilt. Just silence and fear. Every shadow became a threat. Every ally could be your end. Visual command. Dark forest path. The crunch of leaves. A sudden rustle. A crow caws from above. Tonight, as the fire crackles gently beside you, we'll walk through the night lives of medieval assassins and others like them. People who lived and died beneath the surface of society. Forgotten spies, betrayed knights, cursed lovers. This won't be a tale of heroes. This is a tapestry of secrets, of what it meant to survive in the margins of history. So rest your head. Let the world outside fall away. You are safe here, within the glow of this ancient fire. But keep your ears open. Because in the world we're about to enter, silence was a weapon, and every story began with a whisper. In the candlelit halls of medieval courts, where silk gowns rustled and goblets gleamed with wine, the true decisions of power were never made aloud. They were whispered. Assassins were never part of the official court. They had no titles, no land, no crest to carry. But they were summoned nonetheless, called upon by kings and queens whose words were law, but whose deeds required silence. At the edge of diplomacy stood a blade. Behind every treaty signed, every heir who rose unexpectedly, or every noble who died too soon, there was often an invisible hand, one that wielded a dagger instead of a quill. Rulers did not always act openly. To eliminate a rival meant civil war. To accuse a cousin of treason meant political scandal. But to make someone disappear quietly in the night, that could be arranged. No trial, no mess, no questions. The first step was always the same: a discreet message, delivered by a trusted advisor or veiled servant. Never direct, but always clear. I need it. Resolved. Those who received such orders rarely had a choice. The assassin, often a desperate soul living on the fringes, understood the price of refusal. Gold was promised, but only obedience guaranteed survival. In the 12th century, during the reign of Henry II of England, 4 knights took it upon themselves to silence a voice that challenged royal authority. Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry never said the words directly, but his frustration was known. His infamous outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" was all the permission the knights needed. Becket was slain inside a cathedral. No trial, no arrest, just a swift, brutal execution under the echoing arches of the church. The aftermath was chaos. The public was outraged. Henry, though likely complicit, publicly repented. He walked barefoot through the streets, submitting to lashes in penance. But the message had been sent. Even in regret, the throne remained intact. Elsewhere in Europe, the powerful Medici family in Florence wielded their influence like a weapon. When rivals threatened their rule, assassination became a tool of governance. In 1478, during Easter Sunday Mass, Giuliano de' Medici was stabbed to death inside the Florence Cathedral by assassins hired by rival nobles attempting a coup. Even the sacred was not safe. Assassins often came from the same streets as their victims: former servants, disgruntled knights, foreign mercenaries. Their motivations varied: coin, revenge, survival. But one truth remained: they were disposable. After the deed, they rarely lived long. Dead men tell no tales. Rulers ensured that their involvement could never be traced. The instructions were spoken, never written. Payment was scattered, delayed, or given in anonymous drops. If the assassin was caught, they were left to die as criminals, not agents of the court. Justice, after all, had to be seen, even when it was blindfolded. In medieval Russia, Ivan the Terrible created the Oprichnina, a secret police force tasked with rooting out enemies of the Tsar. They were state-sponsored assassins, riding black horses, wearing black robes. Villages trembled at the sight of their arrival. They acted on the Tsar's word, with no oversight. Entire families vanished overnight. The line between law and murder blurred entirely. In these power games, loyalty meant nothing. An assassin might succeed, only to be eliminated by the very monarch who hired them. Loose ends were a threat, and the best way to keep a secret was to bury it. This was the reality behind the royal veil. To rule a kingdom was to balance diplomacy with brutality. Smiles in the day, blood in the night. Words on scrolls, but truth in steel. The assassin was never named in the chronicles, but they were there, between the lines, always there, waiting in silence. Next, we uncover the tools behind these shadows, the poisoned chalices, the silent daggers, and the strange science behind medieval murder. The art of killing quietly, and the risks when silence fails. Not every assassin struck with a blade. Some killed with a sip. In the quiet corners of medieval kitchens, in the back rooms of apothecaries, and behind the closed doors of castles, a deadlier weapon brewed: one with no shine, no sound, and often no warning. Poison. To poison someone in the Middle Ages was not just a crime. It was considered sorcery, alchemy, witchcraft, devil's work. And yet, it was everywhere. In royal courts, in lovers' quarrels, in the cells of political prisoners. It was the choice of the silent killer. No sword fight, no chase, just a slow unraveling. The earliest poisons were derived from plants. Belladonna, also called deadly nightshade, was used to dilate pupils, but taken in larger doses, it paralyzed the nervous system. Hemlock brought a calm, trembling death. Wolfsbane could stop a heart within hours. But poison was not an exact science. Doses varied, effects were unpredictable. Too little, and the victim lived. Too much, and suspicion followed. The assassin had to walk a razor's edge, killing discreetly, but effectively. There were no labs, no purity tests, just trial and error, often with fatal results. In Renaissance Italy, the notorious Borgia family perfected the art. Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Pope Alexander VI, was rumored to wear a hollow ring. Inside, a capsule of poison. With a subtle twist, she could drop it into a goblet during dinner. A toast, a smile, and death within days. Not all poisonings were immediate. Some were designed to mimic natural illness, fevers, vomiting, confusion. By the time anyone suspected foul play, the body was already buried or burned. Even the court physicians were powerless to prove it. In Russia, Tsar Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, was obsessed with poisoning. He employed food tasters, used silver goblets that tarnished in contact with poison, and forced enemies to dine with him while he watched their reactions closely. And yet, he too was said to experiment with poisons on prisoners, refining what worked and what didn't. But poison had one fatal flaw. It left behind suspicion. Unlike the assassin's blade, poison could never be guaranteed to kill immediately. If the victim suspected, they could survive. They could speak. They could accuse. That's when blades returned to the shadows. The dagger was the most reliable method. Close, fast, final, often small, curved, easy to conceal. It could be hidden beneath cloaks, in boots, or sewn into belts. A swift thrust under the ribs or across the throat, and it was over. But even here, skill mattered more than strength. Assassins had to strike with precision. The heart, the neck, the kidneys. Miss the mark, and the target might scream, struggle, call for help. Assassins trained on pigs, similar in weight to a man. They learned the resistance of flesh, the feel of bone. They practiced not just how to kill, but how to do it quietly. Because silence was survival. Then there were garrots, thin cords used to strangle. Wrapped around the neck from behind, they silenced instantly. No blood, no stains, just a limp body in a dark hallway. They were favorites of assassins working in silence. No need to explain why a man had a knife in his back. No blood trail leading out of a room. Just breath, stolen in the dark. Still, no tool was perfect. Every method carried risk. A poisoned drink could be refused. A dagger could miss. A garrote could slip. The assassin had only one chance. One mistake meant capture. And in the Middle Ages, being caught was a fate far worse than death. Captured assassins were tortured until they confessed. Not just who hired them, but who else was involved. Their families were questioned, their homes searched, and the punishment was public. Boiling, burning, beheading. Their deaths were turned into theater, warnings to others tempted to follow the same path. The tools of their trade were destroyed, their names erased from records, their bodies buried in shame. But some survived, the truly skilled, the ones who never missed. They lived between borders, hiding behind fake names, sometimes hired again, sometimes vanishing forever into the mist. Their daggers dulled, their poisons emptied, their pasts buried. But the fear they left behind lingered in castles, in churches, in whispered warnings passed from monarch to monarch. The knowledge that power, no matter how divine or inherited, was never safe from a silent in medieval courts. Trust was currency, and betrayal its price. Every stone corridor, every banquet table, every servant's glance held a question. Who is loyal, and who is listening? Assassins did not always come from distant lands. Sometimes they walked the same halls as their targets, spoke the same language, wore the same crest. They were inside. Some were knights, others scribes or stewards. Some were even family. The most effective assassins were those no one expected. A brother, a lover, a trusted guard. Betrayal began with motive, power, jealousy, greed, a promised title, a forgotten insult, a shift in favor. In the fragile hierarchy of feudal life, one whisper could unseat a lord. One hidden hand could claim a throne, and it often started with a secret. In the 14th century, during the chaotic reign of King Richard II of England, conspiracies bloomed within the royal court like poison vines. Courtiers plotted against each other, spreading lies, forging documents, bribing guards. Some were uncovered, others succeeded. In 1397, 3 noblemen, brothers in arms, were accused of plotting against the king. One was executed, another imprisoned, the third vanished. To this day, no one knows the full truth. But the message was clear. Loyalty could shift with the wind. Assassins paid by the crown could become liabilities overnight. The same monarch who handed you the target one month could name you as the traitor the next. Because the throne trusted no one forever. Once your usefulness ended, so did your protection. Some assassins met their end not in battle, but at the hands of their employer, silenced to preserve secrecy. Their reward for loyalty was a final betrayal. There are stories of messages delivered by poisoned scrolls, of envoys sent to assassinate foreign rivals, only to disappear before completing the task. Some were caught by enemies, others were betrayed by those who hired them, sacrificed to save face, and in some cases, the assassin never existed. Only a rumor whispered by a court advisor, blaming a convenient ghost for a murder done with royal approval. No blade, no witness, no name. In the Holy Roman Empire, power struggles between lords often spilled into assassination, and within those stone halls, betrayal was often rewarded. Informants were more valuable than soldiers. A chambermaid could overhear a secret. A guard could unlock a door. A steward could misplace a key. Each small betrayal paid in silver. Quiet, simple, deadly. Even church officials were not immune. Inside monasteries and cloisters, where one might expect peace and piety, politics and ambition festered. Some monks served as informants to bishops. Some bishops, in turn, conspired with nobles, and some nobles used assassins not just to eliminate threats, but to manipulate the church itself. The circle of betrayal never ended. It simply changed names. Even among assassins, loyalty was fragile. They watched their backs constantly, knew that their fellow killers might one day be ordered to silence them. Trust was a luxury few could afford. Companionship? Dangerous. A slip of the tongue could end your life. They moved alone, ate alone, slept with a dagger within reach. There is a tale told from the courts of medieval France. A noblewoman, fearing her husband's rise in court, secretly hired an assassin. The deed was done swiftly, but days later, the same assassin returned, this time under the employ of her rival. She vanished within the week. In this world, betrayal was a ladder, and every rung was stained with blood. And yet, despite all the danger, the system endured. Assassins kept being hired, secrets kept being sold, because power has always feared the blade it cannot see. And in the candlelit silence of a royal hall, even the most confident monarch slept with one eye open. As long as there were thrones to sit on, there were always those waiting to knock them over. And some didn't use swords. They used trust. To kill was one thing. To vanish without a trace was another. In the world of the medieval assassin, escape was as important as the strike. There were no police radios, no false passports, no cars to outrun the law. The assassin relied on two weapons after the kill: disguise and deception. The first rule of survival: never be the same person twice. Assassins learned to shift their appearance quickly, becoming a monk in the morning, a beggar by night. They altered their posture, their walk, even their accent. A limp could be feigned, a missing tooth faked with wax. In crowded cities, the illusion didn't need to last long, just long enough to disappear. In Venice, the crowded canals became havens for quick getaways. An assassin could stab a merchant in a narrow alley, drop into the water, and emerge blocks away as a fisherman or gondolier. Masks helped too. Carnival season gave everyone an excuse to cover their face. Elsewhere, masks were not festive. They were functional: leather cowls, plague masks, executioner hoods. Many assassins wore them not to terrify, but to confuse. Witnesses gave conflicting descriptions. Some said the killer was tall, others swore he limped. Some remembered a red scarf, others a black feather. By the time the guard arrived, the assassin was already someone else. But the art of disguise wasn't only physical, it was psychological. Assassins often posed as someone forgettable: a tinker, a stable boy, a traveling priest. Someone who would not be remembered the next day. And if they needed to get closer to a high-ranking target, they played roles even more carefully. A guest at the feast, a messenger with a royal seal, a physician carrying bitter medicine. Sometimes, assassins used doubles, partners dressed similarly to cause confusion. One entered from the north gate, the other left from the south. By the time guards caught up, they were chasing a ghost in the wrong direction. Other times, animals were used. Pigeons carried messages. Dogs barked as distractions. Horses were switched mid-flight to avoid being followed. The strategy was simple: confuse, distract, disappear. But the most powerful tool of all was silence. Assassins said little. They carried no letters, no tokens, nothing that could identify them. They memorized routes, landmarks, and schedules. They worked at night, in storms, in crowded festivals. They studied escape paths long before the job. Some even greased doors and hinges ahead of time, days before the strike, ensuring that no creak would give them away. In larger guilds, safe houses were maintained. Small, hidden rooms above taverns, behind stables, beneath chapels. Places where bloodied clothes could be burned, wounds could be treated, and new identities created. False documents were forged, names changed, stories rehearsed, and just like that, the killer vanished. Some assassins fled the city entirely, traveling to another town, blending in as pilgrims or traders. Medieval Europe was a web of borders and dialects. Disappearing into the wilderness was easier than many imagine. All it took was patience and quiet. In the east, members of the famed Hashashin order, operating in the mountains of Persia and Syria, used misdirection not only to escape, but to spread fear. They left tokens behind, daggers plunged into pillows, blood-written warnings, strange symbols carved in doors, reminders that they could vanish as easily as they appeared. Sometimes, the greatest trick was not running at all. Some assassins walked calmly from the scene, blending into the very crowd that would later search for them. They stood among onlookers, shook their heads at the tragedy, and vanished during the chaos of blame. No one suspected the man who looked the most ordinary. Not all succeeded. Some were recognized, some were caught, and some chose to die rather than reveal their guild, their contract, or their employer. For to speak was to betray, and betrayal had only one end. But the best, the truly skilled, they were never seen again. Not because they ran far, but because they never truly existed in the first place. Far from the thrones and noble halls, another world thrived in secret. A world of cobbled alleyways, flickering oil lamps, and whispered names. A world where death could be arranged for a price, no questions asked. This was the underworld of the medieval city, where guilds dealt not in metal or fabric, but in blood. In cities like Florence, Venice, Constantinople, and even London, urban sprawl gave birth to an invisible network, brotherhoods bound not by kin, but by contract. These were not assassins of legend. They were workers, craftsmen of the kill. Many were former soldiers, thieves, or exiled mercenaries, men with no place in society, but a keen understanding of violence. They called themselves many names. Some used symbols, a coiled snake, a red glove, a black feather. Others used code phrases or marks scratched into doors. Few records survive. That was the point. These were not nobles. These were professionals. In 14th century Florence, a feared group known as La Mano Nera, the Black Hand, offered services to those wealthy enough to afford discretion. They operated under the guise of a tradesmen's guild, masking their meetings as legitimate business. Clients arrived in secret. Agreements were made without words. A coin pouch placed on a table. A subtle nod. The rest was handled. Targets could be rivals, lovers, debtors, even family. Killing for money was nothing new, but killing in organized fashion? That required discipline. Guilds created codes, rules, internal justice. If a member betrayed the order, they were removed, permanently. The strength of the guild depended on secrecy. No one could draw attention. Some guilds used initiation rituals. Others swore oaths before blood-soaked daggers. Once you were in, there was no walking away. But even these dark guilds had structure. There were ranks, novices, operatives, and overseers. Jobs were assigned based on skill, surveillance, interrogation, elimination. The most trusted handled contracts involving the wealthy and powerful, those who paid in gold but demanded absolute silence. No two hits were alike. Some were meant to look like accidents, a broken cartwheel, a sudden fall. A fire started in the night. Others were direct, a slit throat in a quiet alley, a staged robbery, a disappearance with no body left behind. In medieval Germany, the Vehmic courts, secret tribunals formed in Westphalia, issued death sentences outside the king's knowledge. They claimed to uphold divine justice, but many of their actions resembled state-sanctioned murder. Their agents, called free judges, traveled the countryside, identifying targets deemed guilty of crimes or heresy. But no trial was held. just a judgment, and then an execution. They left behind tokens, a knife placed on the chest, a branch tied with string, a sign of justice served. But who truly judged them? No one dared ask. Fear was their protection, and secrecy their shield. Guilds of death were rarely caught. When they were, they vanished behind bought officials, burned records, or a convenient second body. They operated not above the law, but around it. Not all members were killers. Some were informants. Others were forgers, healers, or money launderers. Assassination was only part of the machine. The real power lay in their network. Spies in taverns, guards on payroll, priests who turned a blind eye. Even couriers could be part of the web. Messages written in lemon juice. Maps concealed beneath double pages. Pouches of gold hidden in false book covers. They moved unseen, yet shaped the city from its shadows. Guilds lasted for decades, some for centuries. Their names changed, but their purpose remained: to kill, clean, and collect. And when the job was done, they disappeared like smoke, leaving only rumors behind. Even today, historians debate their existence. Were they real, or tales passed down by fearful merchants and guilty nobles? But traces remain: buried codes in ancient ledgers, unmarked graves, buildings with bricked-up cellars, names that were scratched out, but never forgotten. The guilds didn't care for glory. They worked for silence, and in a time where survival meant knowing who to trust, they thrived. To kill was one thing. To vanish without a trace was another. In the world of the medieval assassin, escape was as important as the strike. There were no police radios, no false passports, no cars to outrun the law. The assassin relied on two weapons after the kill: disguise and deception. The first rule of survival: never be the same person twice. Assassins learned to shift their appearance quickly, becoming a monk in the morning, a beggar by night. They altered their posture, their walk, even their accent. A limp could be feigned, a missing tooth faked with wax. In crowded cities, the illusion didn't need to last long, just long enough to disappear. In Venice, the crowded canals became havens for quick getaways. An assassin could stab a merchant in a narrow alley, drop into the water, and emerge blocks away as a fisherman or gondolier. Masks helped too. Carnival season gave everyone an excuse to cover their face. Elsewhere, masks were not festive. They were functional: leather cowls, plague masks, executioner hoods. Many assassins wore them not to terrify, but to confuse. Witnesses gave conflicting descriptions. Some said the killer was tall. Others swore he limped. Some remembered a red scarf. Others, a black feather. By the time the guard arrived, the assassin was already someone else. But the art of disguise wasn't only physical, it was psychological. Assassins often posed as someone forgettable: a tinker, a stable boy, a traveling priest, someone who would not be remembered the next day. And if they needed to get closer to a high-ranking target, they played roles even more carefully. A guest at the feast, a messenger with a royal seal, a physician carrying bitter medicine. Visual command, a noble feast. Laughter fills the hall. A quiet figure in servant's robes tops off a goblet, pausing just long enough to glance at a nearby guard, then walks away unseen. Sometimes assassins use doubles, partners dressed similarly to cause confusion. One entered from the north gate, the other left from the south. By the time guards caught up, they were chasing a ghost in the wrong direction. Other times, animals were used. Pigeons carried messages. Dogs barked as distractions. Horses were switched mid-flight to avoid being followed. The strategy was simple: confuse, distract, disappear. But the most powerful tool of all was silence. Assassins said little. They carried no letters, no tokens, nothing that could identify them. They memorized routes, landmarks, and schedules. They worked at night, in storms, in crowded festivals. They studied escape paths long before the job. Some even greased doors and hinges ahead of time, days before the strike, ensuring that no creak would give them away. In larger guilds, safe houses were maintained. Small, hidden rooms above taverns, behind stables, beneath chapels. Places where bloodied clothes could be burned, wounds could be treated, and new identities created. False documents were forged, names changed, stories rehearsed, and just like that, the killer vanished. Some assassins fled the city entirely, traveling to another town, blending in as pilgrims or traders. Medieval Europe was a web of borders and dialects. Disappearing into the wilderness was easier than many imagine. All it took was patience and quiet. In the East, members of the famed Hashashin order, operating in the mountains of Persia and Syria, used misdirection not only to escape, but to spread fear. They left tokens behind: daggers plunged into pillows, blood-written warnings, strange symbols carved in doors. Reminders that they could vanish as easily as they appeared. Sometimes, the greatest trick was not running at all. Some assassins walked calmly from the scene, blending into the very crowd that would later search for them. They stood among onlookers, shook their heads at the tragedy, and vanished during the chaos of blame. No one suspected the man who looked the most ordinary. Not all succeeded. Some were recognized, some were caught, and some chose to die rather than reveal their guild, their contract, or their employer. For to speak was to betray, and betrayal had only one end. But the best, the truly skilled, they were never seen again. Not because they ran far, but because they never truly existed in the first place. And most often, they died in silence too. For medieval assassins, death did not always come from the blade of an enemy. More often, it came from behind, by the very hand that had once paid for their services. You see, the assassin was a useful tool, until they weren't. After the job was done, there was often no reward, only erasure. A nobleman might deny hiring them. A bishop might declare them heretics. A king might send soldiers after them, declaring that the assassin had gone rogue. It was the perfect alibi. No witnesses, no confessions, no loose ends. Guilds, if they existed, were no sanctuary either. Some were nothing more than whispered names and burnt messages. Others were as cruel to their own as they were to outsiders. Failure or suspicion of betrayal could mean death. Even a perfectly executed mission could turn fatal if it was too successful. If the employer feared exposure, feared that the assassin knew too much, or simply wanted no debt left unpaid, a clean job left no witnesses, and that included the assassin. Some assassins tried to hide. They settled far from cities, in forests, in caves, in the fringes of society. They changed names, shaved their beards, started new lives. But paranoia was a loyal companion. They heard footsteps behind every tree. They slept lightly, if at all. They never trusted a stranger's smile. Others took vows, became monks, or disappeared into the cloisters. But even there, silence was not safe. The old gods might have forgiven them, but men did not. A nobleman whose cousin had been killed would never rest easy. A lord who once paid for a dagger might one day fear his own sleep. And so, the killer must be killed. Some tried to fight back, to bargain, to threaten. But who could they threaten? Assassins had no allies, no union, no law. Their very existence was denied by those who needed them most. In time, many simply faded into myth, ghost stories told in taverns. But those who survived long enough learned the oldest lesson of the trade. Power does not keep promises, and those who kill for coin often die for silence. In the East, the Hashashin knew this truth intimately. Their fortress strongholds, like Alamut, were not just bases. They were prisons. Few ever left. Those who did were watched, followed, silenced. It wasn't cruelty. It was control. Their loyalty was ensured through drugs, fear, and belief. Once broken, they were removed, quietly, efficiently. But the West was no kinder. In England, a paid killer might be declared a heretic. In France, burned as a witch. In Spain, handed over to the Inquisition. Assassins didn't get trials. They got flames, or dungeons, or sudden disappearances. Even those few who rose in wealth and reputation, those who amassed gold, influence, connections, were never truly safe. One whispered name, one forgotten secret, and everything could collapse. They lived in the shadows, and the shadows, in time, claimed them back. And yet, despite it all, others always rose to take their place. Why? Because power is greedy, and kings are never satisfied. Because revenge whispers louder than fear, and some men cannot resist the thrill of being unseen, even if it means dying as a shadow. The price of being a medieval assassin was never just paid in blood. It was paid in identity, in memory, in trust. They were ghosts before they died, nameless before they were buried, and though their daggers shaped history, history never remembered their names. But now, let us step away from the blade and into the homes and lives of those left behind. The families who never knew, the lovers who wondered why he never came home, the mothers who lit candles for sons who never returned. They slipped away in the night, and for those left behind, there were no answers, no letters, no grave, no body to mourn. To be loved by an assassin was to love a shadow. To be the child of one was to carry a silence no one dared explain. They never said where they were going. They never said when or if they'd return. And when they didn't, there were only questions. Whispers from neighbors, judgment from priests, suspicion from lords. A woman whose husband vanished overnight might be accused of harboring a criminal. A child growing up fatherless might be branded cursed. Even the elderly parents of a missing son could be punished for his unseen crimes. You see, the medieval world believed in blood ties. If your kin sinned, the stain spread to you. And yet, for every mother who wept, for every wife who lit candles, for every child who searched the woods, there were also those who never knew. Because assassins, especially the careful ones, never revealed who they truly were. Some pretended to be traveling merchants. Others claimed to be messengers, soldiers, even wandering monks. They smiled at the dinner table, shared stories by the fire, held their children close, and then vanished forever. Those who were left behind often believed it was their fault. Did he leave because of me? Did I say something wrong? Was he taken? Killed? Punished? But they never knew. Because no one came knocking, no one came explaining, and the silence was more brutal than death. In some towns, rumors would swirl, especially if the assassin's last job had been nearby. I heard he was a spy for the French. They say he killed a bishop. I saw his horse tied near the mill that night. But there was never proof. only shadows and fear. So those left behind learned to stay quiet, to lower their eyes, to bury memories like the dead. Children often suffered most. Without a father's name or presence, many were forced into labor, or worse. Some were taken by the church, some sent to workshops, others vanished into the cities, never to be seen again. And in their hearts, they carried the weight of a man they never truly knew. In rare moments, an assassin might try to return home, quietly. But what could they say? How do you explain years of absence? How do you tell your child that your hands are stained with blood? Most turned away, watched from a distance, left offerings at doorsteps, listened to laughter behind windows they could no longer knock on, and sometimes they were recognized, not by the family, but by those hunting them. To return was to risk everything, and many were caught not by soldiers, but by their own guilt. So what did the assassin leave behind? Not gold, not glory, not names carved in stone, but questions, unanswered prayers, candles burned low, empty chairs by the fire, and for every secret they kept, someone else lived in silence. But in the hidden corners of the medieval world, where families wept and names were erased, another reality took root. There were no calling cards, no signatures left behind. But for those who knew, the signs were everywhere. To survive in the shadows, medieval assassins needed more than skill with a blade. They needed language, not words, not speech, but a language of symbols, of placement, of timing. A door left slightly ajar, a feather tied to a lantern post, a piece of bread cut in half and left on a windowsill. These weren't accidents, they were messages. The symbols changed with regions. In Italy, assassins favored etched vines and thorns. In France, it was chalk lines in alleyways. In the German states, it was the placement of candles or spilled grain. Only a few could read them. Even fewer could write them. Because learning this language meant initiation, every order of assassins, whether rogue, royal, or religious, had its own code. But they all shared one thing. Secrecy was survival. There were no books, no parchments, only memory. An apprentice would study under a master for years, learning the hidden grammar of the streets. A circle with a dot, safe to meet. A triangle with its base broken. Mission failed. A line across a bird drawn in charcoal. You are being watched. Some symbols weren't drawn at all. They were acted out. A tap on the shoulder twice, then once. A cough followed by the crossing of arms. Even the tilt of a head while ordering wine could mean, don't speak, danger nearby. Visual command. A bustling tavern. A cloaked man makes eye contact with another patron, touches his left ear, then downs his drink. The second man leaves immediately. But what truly bound assassins together was the oath. Silent, sacred, final. Taken in the shadows, witnessed by only one or two others, often marked by a single drop of blood on a stone or weapon. Breaking it meant death. Not just for the oath breaker, but for anyone they had ever spoken to. The oaths varied. Some swore loyalty to a brotherhood, others to a code of silence. A few pledged services to a hidden king or a forgotten cause. But the result was the same. Once inside, you never left. Those who tried to escape the life were often hunted by their own, because what one knew could bring down many, and so many stayed, not out of loyalty, but out of fear, out of guilt, out of duty to the dead. You see, symbols were not just for survival. They were for memory, each mark, each whisper, each hidden object. It was a connection, to others, to something bigger, to a story no one else could see. And within these symbols were warnings. Before a job, they'd mark the routes. After a mission, they'd mark the death site. In moments of regret, some even marked their own homes, leaving clues behind for children they would never see again. A feather beneath a stone, a sun carved upside down, a doll placed near the hearth. Tiny signs that they had once existed, once loved, once lived. Of course, others twisted the codes, used the assassin's signs to frame enemies, spark fear, or manipulate the lords. This betrayal brought chaos to many cities. When anyone could draw a dagger on a door, who could be trusted? So the language evolved, grew more complex, more personal. Some assassins began hiding codes inside songs, others within riddles or even herbal mixtures. One sip of bitterroot wine at a banquet might mean, the prince dies tonight. And yet, even the most loyal killers knew that one day the code would fail. A message unread, a symbol misdrawn, a child who did not understand. And when that happened, everything unraveled. But beneath the ruin and betrayal, the symbols remained. Silent witnesses, guardians of lost oaths, stories carved into stone and wood, long after their authors had vanished. Because even if the assassin never returned, their marks lingered, and somewhere, someone could still read them. And so we move forward into the final part of this section. The assassin's world was not only shadows and blood, it was also filled with codes, symbols, secret networks, and a language only the dead understood. Let us now step further into that world. A place of symbols carved into stones, messages hidden in ink, and rituals lost to time. They say silence is golden, but for the medieval assassin, silence was iron, heavy, unyielding, unforgiving. To be an assassin was to carry many things, weapons, tools, poisons, but the heaviest burden of all was the silence. Not just the silence of staying hidden, but the silence after the job was done. The silence of knowing, of remembering, of never being able to tell another soul. There were no confessions, no diary entries, no words whispered to a lover late at night, because those words could kill. So instead, they buried everything inside. Mission after mission, death after death, name after name. Some learned to forget, others could not. The rules of the oath were strict. No mourning, no grieving, no questioning. Once the blade was drawn, the deed was done. But hearts don't follow rules. Some assassins kept tokens, a ribbon, a button, a strand of hair, not trophies, but reminders of what they'd lost, of who they had once been. There were those who killed for coin, and they slept easily. But many didn't. Because beneath the mask, behind the shadows, they were human. They had doubts. They had nightmares. They had regrets. It wasn't just the killing. It was the isolation. To be trusted with secrets so deep meant being trusted by no one else. Even among fellow assassins, there was caution. Because friendships could become vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities could be fatal. So many lived alone, dined alone, died alone. And then there was the fear, not fear of being caught. Assassins prepared for that, but the fear of being remembered, because to be remembered was to be found, and to be found was to bring ruin to everything you ever touched. So they erased themselves, burned letters, used false names, changed homes like they changed cloaks. They became ghosts long before they died. Even in life, they lived in the past tense. People would ask, where did he come from? What's her story? And the answer was always the same. No one knew. Not really. But deep down, many wanted to be known. Not as killers, but as people. Some left poems behind, hidden in margins of stolen books. Others carved their names into stone ruins no one visited. A few even saved lives, secretly, quietly, trying to tip the scales back. Not because they had to, but because they needed to. Still, redemption was rare. Most assassins died as they lived, alone, unmarked, unremembered, and yet they left echoes. In the hushed stories told by old innkeepers, in the warnings whispered to children about men in hoods, in the faded drawings etched beneath castle stones. Some say a few lived long enough to find peace, retired to the countryside, changed names, tilled land, held grandkids. But even then, they never spoke of the past, because the weight of silence never truly leaves. And so, the life of a medieval assassin wasn't just danger and death. It was silence. Heavy, endless, sacred. A silence that outlived even the sharpest blade. And in that silence, they waited. For understanding, for peace, or perhaps for sleep. Now let us leave them behind for a while, their weight carried into the dark. Ahead lies a new tale. Another corner of the medieval world. Another struggle in shadows. Another soul, fighting, surviving, and hoping for rest. He had once been Brother Thomas of Whitestone Abbey, a quiet monk cloaked in the rhythm of prayer and the steady echo of his footsteps on cold stone. His days were filled with chants, scripture, and silence. So much silence, the kind that creeps into the bones. But the world outside the cloister walls had grown darker, louder, and far more dangerous. And Thomas, with his keen memory and unassuming manner, caught the attention of men who dealt in secrets. Stone columns. Beyond the window, dark clouds gather. They approached him after vespers one rainy evening. Men in noble clothing, soaked and stern. They spoke of duty, of God, of protecting the realm. They offered him parchment, not coin, and a different kind of faith. A faith in service, in deception, in sacrifice. And so, the monk became something else. Not quite a soldier, not quite a thief. A silent shadow cloaked in scripture and subterfuge. Brother Thomas, or simply the brother as he came to be called, was the perfect spy. No one suspected the monk in the corner of the room, eyes lowered in humility. He moved from monastery to court, abbey to castle, carrying more than just the words of the gospel. Under his robes, hidden in the folds of his prayer book, were messages, codes, and names, each one a threat, each one a weapon. His missions were many. He passed information on traitorous lords to the crown, smuggled letters across war-torn borders, and once even impersonated a bishop to infiltrate a foreign court. He rarely spoke. He didn't have to. His silence made him trustworthy. His robe made him invisible. But it wasn't the missions that wore him down. It was the duality. By day, he was a man of peace, reading the Psalms, tending gardens, hearing confession. By night, he transcribed the sins of kings, marked death warrants with coded ink, and listened to secrets not meant for holy ears. He wondered often what God would think of him now. Was he still a monk, or merely wearing a monk's skin? In his travels, he saw things few monks ever did. The splendor of royal courts, the cruelty of dungeons, the hunger in war-torn villages. He walked through cities burning with plague and palaces stained with conspiracy. And through it all, he remained quiet, watching, recording, reporting, and yet, even in the silence, doubts crept in. One winter, while hiding in a crumbling priory, he came across a boy no older than 13. The child was a novice monk, curious and kind, eager to serve. He reminded Thomas of himself, long before the shadows. The boy asked him why his eyes looked so tired. The monk said nothing. He tried once to walk away, to return to the stillness of monastic life. But secrets cling tighter than chains. The world he had helped shape would not let him go. Not yet. A courier found him within weeks. Another mission, another scroll, another name. So he obeyed. Not for coin, not for power, but because he had come to believe that if he didn't act, others, far worse, would. He told himself that every lie he carried spared someone else from telling it. Every truth he uncovered helped preserve a fragile peace. He told himself these things every night. His final mission came not with fanfare, but a whisper. A conspiracy involving the crown, a threat buried in a coastal abbey. He went in as he always did, quietly, robed, unnoticed. But this time someone noticed, perhaps a slip, perhaps a betrayal, perhaps fate. They found his coded texts, the scroll, the dagger he had never once drawn. He did not resist. He could not explain. To speak would unravel everything. So he remained silent. To the end. His execution was swift and unremarkable, recorded as heresy. No one questioned it. No one remembered. But in the margins of an old prayer book found years later, someone had written, "Faith can be a weapon, and silence a shield." Thus ended the life of a man who lived between two worlds, peace and violence, truth and deception. Not quite monk, not quite murderer, just necessary. And as the candle of his story fades, we are left with the whisper of questions. What would you give to protect peace? And what would you become in the process? The flicker of the fire grows softer now. Let us breathe and prepare for the next tale, one born not in silence but in steel. The castle was more than a fortress. It was a labyrinth of secrets. For the medieval assassin, infiltrating such spaces was a task of immense peril. The moment one passed through those massive gates, disguised as a servant, a scribe, or perhaps a monk, the weight of the mission pressed upon every step. One wrong glance, one misplaced word, and death would come swiftly, either at the hands of guards or as a drawn-out public execution meant to entertain a bloodthirsty crowd. But the real danger often lay not outside, but within. Every castle had its own ecosystem of politics, suspicion, and silent betrayals. Kitchen hands whispered to stable boys, and the lady of the manor often knew more than she let on. There were eyes everywhere, maids loyal to mistresses, knights bound by fealty, and children whose games turned into spying rituals for curious ears. The assassin had to become invisible, not by cloak or magic, but through perfect mimicry of behavior, routine, and silence. Inside the castle, poison was the assassin's most valuable ally, silent, effective, and hard to trace. But getting it into the right chalice, or slipping it into a platter prepared under watchful eyes, was its own act of theater. You couldn't simply walk into the Lord's chambers. You needed access. You needed trust. Or you needed to manipulate someone who had both. And even then, success wasn't guaranteed. A miscalculation in dosage could leave the target sick, not dead. And a sick noble often brought healers, alchemists, and priests, all capable of detecting foul play. That meant torture for the one caught, or worse, imprisonment in oubliettes, where darkness and starvation were companions till the end. Yet the assassin persisted. Each castle held opportunities, despite the perils. A feast meant more wine flowing, more servants bustling, and less attention on a disguised face. A tournament drew crowds, merchants, and foreign knights, Perfect chaos for slipping in unnoticed. A royal birth celebration, a funeral wake, or the visit of a distant bishop, all were carefully studied events where shadows could strike unseen. In these moments, the assassin was not simply a killer. He was a strategist, an actor, a ghost, and his stage, the very heart of power. But ghosts can become trapped. For every successful assassination, there were dozens that failed. And within the castle, failure didn't mean exile. It meant capture, confession under duress, names given. And sometimes, entire villages razed to send a message that shadows do not rule in the light. This was the grim irony of castle infiltrations. So much knowledge, planning, and patience, all for a single moment. A single poisoned sip, a single plunge of a blade. And if it failed, in these towering stone walls, danger didn't just lurk, it lingered. No matter how silent the step or how perfect the disguise, there came a moment in many assassins' lives when the roles reversed, when the predator became the prey. Assassins operated in secrecy, but secrecy has a half-life. Someone always talked. A servant noticed a stranger's face twice. A guard recalled a misplaced accent. A local healer grew suspicious after treating a sudden wave of vomiting nobles. And once suspicion took root, it spread fast, like fire in dry brush. There was no trial when an assassin was suspected. No need for certainty. The act of being accused was damning enough. Torches were lit, search parties organized, castles turned to fortresses once more, locking gates, doubling guards, setting traps. And the assassin, no matter how clever, now had to survive a game designed by those who controlled all the pieces. Escape meant navigating secret passageways, bribing terrified servants, or leaping from towers into rivers black as ink. Even then, the journey was far from over. The roads were dangerous, patrolled by mercenaries. Forests held both wolves and bounty hunters. And in villages, the assassin's face could be sketched in charcoal and nailed to tavern walls. Some assassins fled for weeks, even months, sleeping during the day, moving by moonlight. They trusted no one, not even fellow guild members who might see betrayal as a means to earn favor with those in power. Each step forward was a gamble. Every noise in the dark could be the end. There were stories, whispered ones, of assassins who vanished entirely, becoming shadows in the wilderness, never to be seen again. Some said they started new lives as monks or mercenaries. Others claimed they were still out there, watching, waiting, learning from their failures. But most simply disappeared. Silenced not by blade or rope, but by the sheer weight of being hunted. To be hunted was not just to face death, it was to face isolation, to question every memory, every decision. Could that boy in the alley have been a spy? Was that barkeep's stammer genuine or rehearsed? Could the whispered prayer in the chapel have been a signal? It was a state of constant alert, and eventually, something broke. Many assassins, once hunted, never returned to their craft. The shadows they had once mastered turned against them. The trust they once wielded as a weapon evaporated. They had seen the full price of the life they chose, and paid in full. In the world of castle walls and secret killings, there were no legends, only cautionary tales. And every hunted assassin, whether captured or vanished, added a new verse to the song no bard would sing in the open. But every noble feared in the dark. Every assassin was an artist in their own grim medium. But unlike the swordsman whose honor gleamed in the sun, the assassin's tools were quiet, intimate, and made to never be seen. These weren't weapons for battlefields. They were instruments for single moments, for silencing breaths, for ending empires in the dead of night. Take, for instance, the dagger. No assassin's collection was complete without one. But this wasn't just any blade. The assassin's dagger was often thin and narrow, made to slip between ribs or silently cut through a throat with minimal effort. Some had hollowed centers to inject poisons as they pierced. Others were curved like a crescent moon, perfect for slicing tendons or gripping tightly in the dark. Then came the poisons, perhaps the assassin's truest companions. They came in dozens of forms. Some killed in seconds, while others left a noble coughing up blood days later, long after the assassin was gone. Powdered nightshade mixed into wine, belladonna on the edge of a letter seal, a few grains of arsenic stirred into soup. To the trained hand, every meal was an opportunity. Every drink, a possible death sentence. But poison was a delicate art. Too much, and it left evidence. Too little, and it spared the target. That's why the assassin often trained not just in apothecary craft, but in alchemy. They had to understand how a human body reacted, how to disguise flavor and delay symptoms. The best poisoners made their kills look like illness, stroke, or even divine punishment. Then there were stranger tools, unconventional but no less deadly. The garrote, a simple wire or silk cord used to strangle a victim silently from behind. The blowpipe, a reed capable of firing tiny venomous darts across a room. Even ink could be deadly, used to write letters laced with toxins that entered through skin. An assassin's creativity was limited only by their cruelty and their target's awareness. Disguises, too, were part of the arsenal. A well-made cloak, a ring bearing the right sigil, a forged document. These were as important as any blade. They gave the assassin access. A stable boy's tunic might let them pass through gates. A nun's robe might get them inside a holy sanctuary. They blended, borrowed, became. That was their power. And yet, for all the tools and tricks, nothing replaced instinct. A true assassin learned to move like water, silent, unnoticed, shaping themselves to every corridor and shadow. They studied footsteps, watched for patterns in the guard changes, measured the time between bells and meals. Every tool was merely an extension of the assassin's patience. They waited longer than most could endure. Hours in the rafters, days watching a door, weeks following a target. The blade may strike in an instant, but the preparation, that was the true weapon. The irony? None of these tools guaranteed success. Even the most skilled assassin risked failure with every move. A missed step, a delayed guard, a sudden sneeze. Death was always near, even for the one delivering it. And so, they trained. Over and over. Practicing with weighted dummies. Coating their own fingers in powder to measure how quickly it could be wiped clean. Inhaling trace poisons to build tolerance. Learning to read faces in a crowd. These were the rituals of those who killed not for glory, but for silence. To the outside world, an assassin seemed to vanish and strike like a ghost. But in truth, they were artisans of fear. Every kill was rehearsed, every escape calculated, and every tool, no matter how crude, was part of a story written in blood and shadows. To become a killer in the shadows was not a choice made lightly, nor was the training one could endure by willpower alone. It was a transformation, a reshaping of the mind, the body, and the soul. You were not merely taught how to kill, you were taught how to disappear, how to become nothing. No sound, no face, no trace. Training often began young. Children were chosen, sometimes orphaned, sometimes taken, and occasionally sold into the trade by desperate families who would never speak of it again. These children didn't begin with weapons. Their first lessons were in silence. They would be made to stand still for hours, even in bitter cold, without moving a muscle. If they scratched an itch or whispered a complaint, the punishment was swift. In some cases, a single mistake meant being left alone in the woods overnight, with wolves nearby and only their fear to keep them company. Every part of their body was honed for control. They learned to breathe without sound, to blink slowly, not nervously, to fall without a thud, to eat without being seen. Every day was a lesson in how not to be noticed. Discipline bordered on cruelty. A student might be ordered to follow a merchant through town for 3 days without being seen, or sneak a coin from a noble's purse without touching the fabric around it. If caught, there was no second chance, only more punishment. They weren't just training to succeed, they were training to never fail. And yet, those who advanced found themselves undergoing stranger tests, catching a cat in total darkness, killing a bird with a single throw of a stone, holding their breath underwater until they saw stars. These were not games, they were survival. By adolescence, the promising few were introduced to real weapons. Not sharp ones at first, wooden replicas designed to bruise, not to kill. Sparring was brutal and often bloody. Pain wasn't avoided, it was expected. A blade to the rib, a blow to the eye. These weren't failures, they were experiences. Mentors, if they could be called that, rarely spoke. They demonstrated. If the student was wise, they would mimic. If not, they were left behind. There were no uniforms, no banners, no medals. There was only silence, shadows, and scars. Eventually came the poison trials. The student was required to prepare their own mixtures, then ingest small amounts to build immunity. Belladonna, hemlock, foxglove, each left their mark. Shaking hands, burning throats. Some didn't survive. Those who did were changed forever. Mental training was equally intense. They learned to forget themselves, to answer to any name, to adopt any persona, a baker, a monk, a beggar. They memorized entire family lineages, studied foreign languages, and recited hundreds of city maps from memory. An assassin could not afford hesitation. When the moment came, they had to be someone else, entirely. Perhaps the darkest rite of passage was the first kill. It wasn't ceremonial. There were no trumpets, no oaths, just a name, a location, a method. The student was sent alone. If they returned, they were no longer a student. Some came back with blood on their hands and silence in their eyes. Others returned hollow, haunted. A few never returned at all. But those who survived, the chosen few, were then given something even rarer than a weapon or name. They were given trust, a signal that they could now take contracts, walk among the highest and lowest in society, and be feared by both. From there, they moved into the world, not as soldiers, but as shadows. They had no allegiance, only contracts. They were trained not to care who they killed, only that they succeeded. Morality had no place in their profession, only efficiency. To the outside world, they were legends, ghosts, myths. But behind the mystery was pain, discipline, and a loneliness few could understand. They weren't born killers. They were made, piece by piece, through silence, struggle, and sacrifice. And that is what made them so terrifying. Not the blades, not the poisons, but the truth that they had chosen to become something the world could never truly see until it was far too late. Every profession has room for error. But in the life of a medieval assassin, a single mistake was rarely forgiven. One wrong move didn't mean a reprimand or a lost wage. It meant death. Either theirs, or worse, an innocence. Mistakes came in many forms: a breath taken too loudly, a step made too quickly, a hesitation when there should have been none. And in those split seconds, entire missions collapsed. Because the truth is, even the most highly trained assassin could not control the chaos of real life. Sometimes, the fault lay not in their skills, but in bad information. A target who wasn't where they were supposed to be. A door that should have been unlocked. A guard who was promised to be drunk, but wasn't. When plans unraveled, assassins had no time to adapt. They had to improvise, often under the cloak of terror. Those who failed to kill were rarely given a second chance by their employers. A contract left unfulfilled could mean political embarrassment, financial losses, or even war. And the assassin, once unseen and untouchable, became the hunted. Punishment for failure varied depending on the guild or master. Some required atonement. Another mission, more brutal than the last. Others offered no such redemption. Failure was often paid for in blood, sometimes by the assassin, sometimes by their family. The harshest guilds believed that if an assassin survived failure, it was only because death wasn't yet done teaching them a lesson. And then there were those who disappeared, not captured, not killed, simply gone. Some said they were taken underground, executed secretly to preserve the organization's reputation. Others believed they were used as training targets for younger assassins, living ghosts hunted by their successors. But not all mistakes ended in death. Some lived with the weight of their error for the rest of their lives. There were assassins who found their hands trembling long after a botched job, who saw the faces of unintended victims in every mirror. Guilt, for those who still felt it, was a heavier burden than any blade. Worse still were the jobs that went too well, the ones where they were told the target was corrupt, only to discover they'd slain a healer, a diplomat, or a parent of 3. In those moments, the veil lifted, and they saw not a career, but a cage of moral compromise. Sometimes they ran. They tried to disappear into the countryside, live quietly as shepherds or monks. But the shadows never truly let them go. The organizations they left behind didn't like loose ends. Retirement wasn't an option. Silence was enforced, not requested. Those who fled often lived in constant fear. Every footstep behind them was a potential pursuer. Every stranger at the tavern might carry a blade. Sleep came rarely. Peace, never. And what of betrayal? There were assassins who turned on their masters. Some revealed secrets to rival kingdoms. Some took contracts they were forbidden to take. For them, death was not swift. It was ritual. It was personal. The sentence for betrayal was often carried out by someone close, someone they'd trained with, trusted. A final lesson in the cost of disloyalty. And yet, even with all this danger, the world never stopped needing them. Rulers always wanted rivals removed. Nobles always needed secrets kept quiet. Greed and ambition never ran dry, and so the cycle continued. Trained, tasked, failed, and punished, but behind every successful assassination lay a sea of forgotten failures. Mistakes buried beneath alley cobblestones. Names scratched from memory. Silent ghosts whose stories would never be told, except in hushed whispers beside a dying fire. And so the life of a medieval assassin was not just dangerous, it was fragile. Built on silence and shattered by the smallest sound. In the shadows of castles and beyond the stone walls of cities, a secret infrastructure pulsed through the medieval world. One not ruled by kings or cardinals, but by unseen networks of power, assassin guilds. To the public, they were myth, ghost stories whispered by firelight. But in the silent alleys and darkened forests, they were as real as the dagger at your throat. These guilds weren't random clusters of killers. They were structured, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. They operated in tiers, with apprentices, journeymen, and masters, each answerable to a strict code. In some regions, these guilds formed secret alliances with nobility, a silent contract. You protect our secrets, and we ensure your enemies disappear. Becoming a guild member wasn't as simple as learning to fight. Recruits were often children, orphans or those stolen from battlefields. They were raised not with love, but with precision, taught to move without sound, to kill without hesitation, to obey without question. Morality was not just discouraged, it was erased. Guildmasters, the unseen hands behind the curtain, held immense power. They controlled who lived and who died in the underworld. They rarely carried out assassinations themselves. They didn't need to. Their words were enough. A raised eyebrow could mean someone's end. Their identities were so protected that even many senior assassins didn't know who led them. Guilds weren't bound by geography. Their reach extended across kingdoms. Couriers carried coded messages between cities, using riddles, symbols, and hidden ink. Safe houses were tucked into taverns, monasteries, and apothecaries. A simple flower in a window might mean safe passage or trap ahead. Among the most infamous were the Black Thorn, the Silent Veil, and the Order of the Hollow Hand. Each had its own philosophies. The Black Thorn believed in poetic vengeance. Their kills always sent a message. The Silent Veil worshipped silence itself. No witness ever survived. The Hollow Hand saw assassination as spiritual, a purification of the world's corruption. Within these guilds, rituals were sacred. Initiations could involve a final test, murdering someone from your past life to prove total loyalty. If you flinched, hesitated, or even asked why, you were either sent back to the bottom or eliminated. Failure within a guild was rare, not because members were perfect, but because mistakes were swiftly silenced. An assassin who failed publicly might be killed by their own within hours. Discipline kept them alive. Fear kept them obedient. The masters ensured balance, enforcing the old codes. No unnecessary killing, no exposure, and never betray the guild. To do so was to forfeit your life and curse your name for generations. It was said that guilds could erase a person's existence so completely, it was as if they were never born. Yet in spite of their darkness, guilds created a strange kind of order. In a world where kings could not trust their knights and nobles poisoned their own brothers, the guilds remained consistent. Expensive, dangerous, but dependable. To some, they were monsters. To others, a necessary evil. And to the assassins raised within these hidden societies, the guild was family. Twisted, cold, and unrelenting, but family nonetheless. The only home they had ever known. In the world of medieval assassins, silence wasn't simply a tactic. It was a creed, etched into their bones from the moment they were inducted. Words were dangerous, names even more so. The fewer spoken truths shared, the stronger the web of secrecy became. Assassins learned early that a slip of the tongue could spell death, not just for themselves, but for everyone connected to them. Conversations were guarded, gestures choreographed, and messages hidden in plain sight. A glance held meaning. A posture was a sentence. Entire strategies were conveyed without uttering a sound. This silence extended beyond the mission. It was observed within the walls of guilds and in daily interactions. Even among trusted allies, the past was off limits. You never asked about someone's origin. You never spoke of your own, where you came from, who you once were. These were memories meant to dissolve, like footprints in the snow. Loyalty, however, filled the void that silence left behind. It wasn't earned overnight. It was bred, shaped, and at times, enforced. The bond between assassins was born from shared training, mutual bloodshed, and the ever-present threat of death. Once you had bled beside someone, once you had covered their escape or buried a body with them, a quiet loyalty grew, something deeper than words. Guilds did not tolerate betrayal. Secrets were currency, and a single leak could cost dozens their lives. To break the code of silence was to invite eradication, not just execution, but obliteration from memory. Your name, your deeds, even your birth records, everything would be purged. It was said some guilds maintained scribes whose sole purpose was to erase defectors from the annals of history. Loyalty extended upward, too, to the guildmaster, to the structure, to the code. If you were ordered to kill a friend, you obeyed. If you were told to wait 3 years in a foreign city for a single target, you waited. Questioning was not your role, execution was. To keep this structure intact, guilds cultivated rituals that reinforced the silence. Some took vows before a council of elders. Others were branded with symbols that reminded them daily of their commitment. And in the rare case an assassin needed to be reminded of their place, they were taken to the Hall of Forgotten, a cold, echoing vault filled with relics of traitors. Daggers, boots, even bones. A reminder that silence was survival. Loyalty wasn't always grim. There were moments of unspoken kindness. An older assassin placing a hand on a trembling apprentice's shoulder after a first kill. A shared meal in silence after days of hunger. Eyes locking in understanding across a crowded square as a mission unfolded. These silent gestures built bonds stronger than any oath. And yet, the paradox remained. Assassins were trained to kill, but also trained to belong. To adhere to rules so strict that breaking them was unimaginable. To never speak of their work, even as their hands bore its scars. The silence, once alien, eventually became comforting. Words had caused pain in their past lives. Lies, betrayal, promises unkept. In the guild, silence was pure. It was safe. And loyalty? It was the closest thing they had to love. In the end, the assassins lived not just for themselves, but for the brotherhood or sisterhood that had taken them in. For the guild that demanded everything and gave only purpose in return. It was a brutal bond, forged in silence and bound in blood. But in a world where trust was rare and mercy rarer still, it was enough. Silence wasn't just a tactic for the medieval assassin. It was doctrine. Spoken words could betray, emotions could unravel years of secrecy, and questions could be fatal. In this world of shadows, silence was life. From the first day of training, initiates were taught that their voices were not their own. They belonged to the guild. Speaking out of turn, even in private, could cost you everything. It wasn't uncommon for recruits to go weeks, sometimes months, without uttering a single word. The guild believed that silence sharpened awareness. If you weren't speaking, you were listening, watching, learning. Loyalty was etched deeper than fear. Each assassin owed their life, training, and purpose to the guild. And in return, The guild gave them identity, stripped of the past, cleansed of sentiment, bound only to purpose. When one joined the Brotherhood of Death, they ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. Their name, if ever spoken again, was spoken only in mourning. Breaking this sacred trust was unthinkable. To betray the guild, to speak of its inner workings, reveal its members, or question its orders, was not simply disobedience, it was blasphemy. The punishment for such heresy was swift and absolute. In many guilds, a traitor wasn't killed in secrecy. Their execution was a lesson, a ritualized, silent demonstration attended by peers. No words were spoken, no cries were allowed, just a blade, a body, and the silence that followed. What made this code even more terrifying was its reach. There was no escape. Assassins who fled their orders or tried to vanish from the guild's grasp were hunted relentlessly. Some were tracked across oceans. Others lived for years under new names, only to be found in their sleep, a dagger pressed gently to their throat with a whisper that sealed their fate. Loyalty wasn't just expected, it was indoctrinated. Recruits were bound through oaths made in blood, some literal, some symbolic. They swore before ancient relics or fires passed down through generations. These weren't empty ceremonies. They were deeply spiritual events that tied the soul to the guild. And loyalty, when tested, wasn't always shown in battle. It was tested in sacrifice. Could you kill someone you once called a friend if the guild demanded it? Could you die silently, without resisting, if ordered to do so? These weren't hypotheticals. They were real scenarios presented to initiates. Some failed. Those who passed were never quite the same afterward. There were moments, rare but powerful, when silence became solidarity. After a successful mission, assassins would return to their guild's sanctuary not to celebrate, but to sit together in quiet reflection. No feasts, no chants, just stillness, each one understanding the cost of what had just been done. And yet, beneath the surface of discipline, an undercurrent of human emotion always threatened to surface. Some assassins formed silent bonds, friendships, even love, expressed through small gestures, a passed loaf of bread, a hidden token in a satchel, a shared glance during a mission. These were dangerous, and if discovered, they were broken as swiftly as any betrayal. The most dangerous trait of all was doubt. Once it crept in, once an assassin questioned the morality of a kill, the righteousness of an order, or the purpose of their guild, it was only a matter of time. Some ended their own lives. Others confessed in whispers, hoping for redemption. Most never had the chance. Doubt was an infection, and guilds amputated without hesitation. Still, there were legends, whispers about assassins who broke free, who walked away, survived the hunt, and lived as ghosts in remote places. The guilds never acknowledged such stories. Officially, no one left. Unofficially, those who escaped were never spoken of. Their names were erased, their loyalty deemed never to have existed. In the end, the code of silence wasn't just about not speaking. It was about the complete submission of the self. To be a true assassin was to become a vessel of obedience, a ghost among the living, to kill with precision, to vanish without trace, to listen more than speak, to obey more than question, and above all, to belong not to oneself, but to the guild. The training that turned young recruits into assassins was not education. It was transformation, brutal, unforgiving, designed to strip away fear, humanity, and even identity. It began the moment a recruit entered the compound. They were not given names, only numbers. No one asked where they came from. No one cared. They were woken before dawn with a bucket of cold water. Meals were meager, deliberately so. Hunger kept the senses sharp. They trained barefoot, on cold stone and rough terrain. Every scar was a lesson, every bruise a silent tutor. There was no praise for success, only punishment for failure. Physical endurance was only the beginning. They were taught to climb, run silently, hold their breath underwater for minutes at a time. They trained with weighted weapons, so real blades would feel light in combat. Balance drills involved walking beams suspended over spikes. One wrong step didn't mean a lecture. It meant injury, sometimes death. The mind, too, was targeted. Sleep deprivation was routine. They were taught to memorize maps in seconds, to read lips across a crowded square, to lie convincingly under torture. Their instructors used psychological games, isolation, betrayal, misinformation, to harden their emotions and forge absolute obedience. Combat training was relentless. Each recruit was paired with another, and only one would walk away from the final trial. It wasn't personal. It was policy. Weakness had no place in the guild. Mercy was a foreign language. They were also trained in poisons, how to brew them, hide them, and apply them without detection. Some learned the art of blending in, disguise, accents, even gender. An assassin could become a beggar, a priest, or a noble at will. To graduate from the program was not a celebration. There was no applause, no embrace. Instead, the final test was often personal. Some were sent to kill someone from their old life, a brother, a mentor, even a parent. The guild reasoned, if the past holds power over you, the enemy can use it. When a recruit passed, they received a new name. It was not chosen by them, nor by any kindness of memory. It was given, bestowed by those who had already shed their own identities. The name was not a celebration, but a burial. It marked the end of the boy, the girl, the orphan, the runaway, the nameless child, pulled from the mud of some forgotten street. Whatever history they had carried, their mother's lullaby, their father's face, the scent of their village fields, all of it ended with that new name. It was the guild's way of reminding them that from this moment onward, they belonged to shadows. They no longer served family or faith. They served silence. These new names were often cruel in their simplicity. One might be called Ash, another Crow, another Stone. Some bore marks of their first mission: knife, poison, whisper. Few were given noble-sounding titles, for nobility was a luxury the guild despised. Their names were tools, like their blades. They were meant to cut ties, to sever memories, to become forgettable in every place except within the hidden walls of the Brotherhood. And yet, to the recruit who had survived years of training, who had endured hunger, cold, and unrelenting discipline, the giving of this name felt like ascension. It was proof that they had passed through fire and had not been consumed. It was proof that they had become something more than the desperate child who had once shivered in the corner of the compound. They were now part of the order, part of an invisible lineage stretching back generations. They were shadows in the making. The first days after earning a name were filled with disorientation. The recruit found themselves listening for their old name, expecting to hear it whispered by memory, only to find silence. Fellow assassins used the new name without hesitation, and soon the old one became like a dream half-remembered, something that lingered at the edge of sleep but vanished upon waking. Some recruits tried to hold on to their pasts, repeating their birth name under their breath at night, carving it into wood, or whispering it into the dark. But time wore it away. Weeks became months. and the guild's discipline was relentless. In the end, almost all forgot. That was the point. With the new name came new duties. They were no longer mere watchers or errand carriers. They were expected to take missions, first as shadows to more experienced assassins, then alone. The transition was terrifying, yet exhilarating. They were sent to watch noble processions from rooftops, to follow merchants across towns without being seen, to slip into banquet halls as servants and report on what they observed. These early tasks did not always end in blood. The guild taught patience before violence. Information was as valuable as steel. A whispered rumor could be worth more than 100 throats cut. Still, sooner or later, the blade was required, and the first mission always left a mark. For some, the strike came easily, a dagger thrust between ribs, the silence of a strangled breath. For others, it lingered for years, haunting their dreams. They saw the eyes of the victim long after the blood had dried. The guild did not comfort them. Comfort was weakness. If they faltered, if guilt clouded their silence, they were erased. Those who endured without breaking grew cold, efficient. They killed, not with joy, but with a clarity that numbed the soul. It was here, in this passage from nameless recruit to named assassin, that many began to realize the true weight of their existence. They were no longer children of the earth, no longer sons and daughters of villages or abbeys. They were ghosts walking in daylight, carrying blades in shadows. Every interaction became a performance, every smile a mask. Even their own reflection grew strange, for the person staring back bore no history, no lineage, no future. Only duty. The guild knew this emptiness well, and it encouraged it. A hollow vessel was easier to shape, easier to command. Without attachments, without names, without memories, the assassin was free of hesitation. And yet, in the secret places of the heart, something always remained. A flicker of the old life, a memory buried too deep to kill. For some, it was a mother's voice. For others, the warmth of a sibling's hand. These memories became ghosts of their own, haunting the assassin long after the world had forgotten them. As the years passed, the named assassins became indistinguishable from one another. They moved alike, spoke alike, carried the same silence. Only in rare moments, around a dying fire, or after a night of blood, would one assassin betray a trace of humanity. A sigh too heavy, a glance too long, a trembling hand that quickly stilled. These cracks in the mask were fleeting, but they revealed a truth that no training could fully erase. Beneath the name, beneath the oath, there was still a person, aching to be remembered. And yet, remembrance was forbidden. The guild's creed demanded erasure. "You were not born," the elders said. "You were made." That was the law. That was the truth they were forced to swallow with every mission, every kill, every silent night. In time, many came to believe it. They convinced themselves they had never been children, never known families, never been anything but blades waiting to be drawn. And in that belief, they found a strange kind of peace. A terrible, quiet peace. But peace is fragile. Even shadows cannot outrun the light forever. The names they were given, Ash, Crow, Whisper, Stone, were not eternal. They too faded in time, replaced by others, forgotten by history. The assassin who had once been a child, then a recruit, then a name, eventually became nothing at all. Their life, their death, their every breath was swallowed by silence. And that is where their story truly began. The silence that followed was not only the absence of words. It was a weight, pressing against every part of the assassin's existence. They learned to walk without footsteps, to breathe without sound, to vanish into the folds of daily life like dust swept into a corner. And yet, the deeper silence was inside, the silence of being forgotten, of no longer having a place in the world beyond the guild. For most, this silence became second nature. They accepted it as one accepts hunger or cold, as a companion that never leaves. But for others, the silence turned to loneliness. It gnawed at them in the long nights between missions, in the stillness after a kill, in the hollow moments when their blade was cleaned, and their clothes carried no scent but steel and sweat. Some tried to fight it, speaking in whispers to themselves, reciting fragments of prayers, or humming songs they no longer remembered fully. But each effort faded. The silence always returned, heavier than before. And yet, within this silence, the assassin discovered something strange. They found that they could hear the world more clearly than others, the rustle of rats in a wall, the faint trickle of water behind a stone, the subtle change in a guard's breathing as he began to drift into sleep. All of it became part of their awareness. Silence sharpened them. It cut them into creatures who noticed what no one else did. The world of noise belonged to the crowds, but the world of silence belonged to them. That sharpened awareness came with a cost. The assassin could never truly rest. Even in sleep, their minds listened for danger. Dreams blurred with memory, and every sound in the night, an owl's cry, a shifting branch, a creaking board, was enough to stir them awake with blade in hand. Rest was not rest. It was another form of waiting. Waiting for a knock, a betrayal, an order, waiting for the silence to break. In time, some assassins came to believe that the silence itself was alive, that it was not merely an absence but a presence, something ancient, something watchful. They gave it names in secret, though never aloud. Some called it the shadow, others the veil. A few, in moments of despair, called it death itself. They believed that this silence was what truly commanded them, that the guild, the masters, the contracts were only instruments of something deeper. And perhaps, in their own way, they were right. For silence ruled their lives more than any master ever could. It dictated their movements, shaped their choices, erased their names, and carried them into the world like phantoms. The silence was both prison and shield. It kept them hidden, yet kept them apart. It protected them, yet devoured them. When one assassin fell, whether in battle, in betrayal, or under the torture of an enemy, the guild did not mourn. There were no funerals, no prayers, no graves. The body was disposed of quietly, or left where it fell. The name, whether ash, crow, or whisper, was passed on to another recruit in time. Thus, the silence consumed even memory. The dead were not spoken of. They had never existed. But for those who lived, the weight of this erasure grew unbearable. Some began to mark themselves in secret, tiny scars cut into the skin, a hidden tattoo inked where no one would look, a symbol carved into the underside of a bed frame. These were their attempts to defy the silence, to leave behind some trace that they had once been real. Not all were discovered. Some survived through centuries, scratched into stone or buried beneath floorboards, found by accident long after the assassin was dust. These marks were their whispers to eternity. I was here. Yet for every mark that survived, countless others vanished. The silence erased them, as it always did. Still, stories lingered. Peasants in taverns whispered of faceless killers who moved like smoke. Nobles muttered of rivals who died too suddenly, too cleanly to be natural. Priests warned their flocks of demons in human form, slipping into homes under moonlight. These were not histories, but legends, half-truths woven from fear. And the assassins themselves, hidden in their guilds, sometimes listened. They heard these tales of themselves told by strangers and wondered what parts of them were true and what parts were shadows of shadows. There were those who grew weary of such a life, assassins who longed, even for a moment, to be known, to be called by their true name again, to live as a person, not as a weapon. A few attempted it. They fled the guilds, shed their cloaks, and tried to live among common folk. But freedom was rarely kind. Without their silence, they were lost. They no longer knew how to live in the open, how to speak without suspicion, how to trust without fear. And the guilds did not forgive. Many were hunted, found, and erased before they could build new lives. Others lived in exile, broken souls wandering forests, whispering their old names to the trees. In rare cases, an assassin lived long enough to fade naturally from the guild's memory. Too old to fight, too slow to kill, too forgotten to be worth the effort of pursuit. These few faded into the countryside, taking up humble lives as shepherds, recluses, or silent monks. They spoke to no one of their pasts. They carried their names to their graves, and no one remembered them. Yet, in their solitude, some found a kind of peace. Not joy, not redemption, but peace. The quiet surrender of one who has outlived even silence. For in the end, that was all the assassin's life was, a dance with silence. They were born into it, trained in it, named by it, and consumed by it. Their legacy was not carved in stone or written in books. It lived only in the spaces between words, in the gaps of history, in the whispers that never made it to parchment. They were the unspoken, the unwritten, the forgotten. And as the centuries passed, their silence grew louder than any voice. It lingered in the stones of castles, in the creak of old taverns, in the shadows of ruined guild halls. It lingered in the very air, waiting for those who still listened. For silence, once born, never truly dies. Yet silence, for all its power, could never erase the longing that flickered deep inside the assassins' hearts. They had been trained to believe they were empty vessels, names without roots, blades without bloodlines, but no training could fully strip away the truth of being human. Beneath the mask, the shadow, the oath, there was still a pulse that remembered the warmth of a cradle, the echo of laughter, the tender ache of belonging. It was this contradiction, the assassin as both ghost and human, that gave their lives such weight. To the world, they seemed like phantoms, gliding in and out of history unseen. But within themselves, they were fragile creatures carrying burdens too heavy for most to imagine. They bore the faces of the dead in their dreams. They carried the secrets of kings in their silence, and they endured the crushing weight of knowing they could never be known. Among them were those who sought to leave something behind, not in names or words, but in actions. There are whispered tales of assassins who spared children, who diverted poison from the innocent, who placed themselves between a blade and the undeserving. Their guilds would never speak of such defiance, and if discovered, they were erased swiftly. Yet in the deep folds of forgotten chronicles, one can still find strange gaps, moments when an heir survived unexpectedly, or when a condemned man lived one night longer than his enemies had planned. Perhaps these were accidents. Perhaps they were the faint rebellions of weary assassins who longed to give back some fragment of life to the world they had taken so much from. But rebellion was dangerous. It clashed with the creed that defined them. To disobey was to invite death, not only upon themselves, but upon anyone they might have loved. And so, the majority bent beneath the silence. They obeyed, mission after mission, until obedience was all they knew. The mind adapts to survival, and the assassin's mind adapted most of all. They learned to bury their regrets as deeply as their victims. They learned to carry silence as both shield and chain. Still, even chains wear thin with time. There were those who, in old age, found their memories flooding back with cruel clarity. As their hands grew too weak for the dagger, as their legs no longer carried them swiftly through alleyways, their minds turned inward. They remembered their mothers' faces. They remembered the fields of their childhood. They remembered the first name they were forced to forget. And in that remembering, sorrow came like a tide. Some wept alone in their final days. Others vanished into wilderness, seeking death in solitude rather than at the hands of their brothers. The guilds rarely spoke of these endings. They preferred to believe that every assassin died in silence, loyal to the creed. But silence itself carried whispers, and even in secrecy, stories escaped. A farmer might recall an old wanderer who prayed at dusk and never gave his name. A monk might write of a ragged pilgrim who confessed to sins too heavy to be imagined. A child might tell of a stranger who gave them bread with trembling hands before vanishing into the mist. These fragments of memory lingered, faint threads left behind by lives that were meant to vanish. And perhaps that is what makes the story of the medieval assassin so haunting. Not the blades they carried, nor the names they erased, but the humanity that struggled to survive beneath it all. No matter how sharp the silence, no matter how deep the shadows, something human always remained. A flicker of kindness, a longing for peace, a memory that refused to die. In time, the world changed. The guilds weakened. The structures that once kept assassins bound dissolved beneath the weight of wars, plagues, and shifting powers. New weapons emerged. New rulers rose. The age of the cloaked killer gave way to the age of gunpowder, to spies, to armies trained in open fields rather than shadows. But even as the guilds crumbled, their silence endured. The methods, the names, the oaths, they lived on in fragments, passed down like embers hidden in ash. Some say the silence never left at all, that it slipped into the cracks of modern life, where secrets still move unseen, where contracts are still written in whispers, where shadows still follow kings and leaders. History has always needed its hidden hands, and the assassin was only the first to shape that role. But the medieval assassin, the boy or girl who lost their name, who took on silence like a second skin, remains unique. They remind us that power is never held only in palaces or courts. It is also carried in footsteps unheard, in daggers unseen, in choices made by those history refuses to name. Their story does not end in glory. It does not end in triumph or fame. It ends in silence, the same silence in which it began. Yet within that silence is a strange kind of echo, a reminder that even the forgotten leave traces, that even shadows have weight, that even those who were meant to vanish entirely still ripple through the world in ways unseen. And so, when we listen closely, when we lean into the quiet, we may still hear them. Not their names, not their confessions, but their presence. The heavy hush of lives lived in secrecy, the quiet ache of sacrifices made in darkness. They are not in the chronicles, but in the spaces between them. They are not sung by bards, but murmured by the wind against castle stones. They are gone, yes, but not entirely. For silence, once carried, lingers forever. The weight of silence was more than absence. It was inheritance. Every assassin who took a name inherited not only the discipline of the guild, but also the accumulated burden of countless lives before them. They walked paths worn by centuries of footsteps, repeated rituals whispered by generations of shadows. Even when their guilds dissolved, even when castles crumbled and kings were forgotten, the silence endured like an unbroken chain. This inheritance was not always visible. It lived in gestures. The way a hood was drawn low, the way a door was tested twice before entering, the way an ear tilted to the faintest crack in the floorboards. These small habits outlived the guilds themselves, passed from teacher to student long after the names of the masters were lost. The assassin was never just an individual. They were a vessel for silence itself, a keeper of a tradition too shadowed for history to write. But inheritance is double-edged. It can give strength, but it can also wound. Many assassins lived with memories they had never earned, the stories of predecessors told as warnings, the failures recited as curses. They grew up haunted not only by their own deeds, but by the knowledge that they were part of a lineage built on betrayal, blood, and erasure. And so their lives became layered with silences, their own, their masters, their guilds, and the silence of centuries pressing down like stone. To most of the world, these assassins were invisible. Yet invisibility was not immunity. Their work shaped nations in ways unseen. The absence of a rival at a banquet table, the sudden fall of a powerful minister, the quiet succession of a new heir, all carried the fingerprints of men and women no chronicle dared name. When kings reigned longer, when wars ended sooner, when treaties were signed under suspiciously smooth conditions, it was often the unseen hand of silence that tilted the balance. Still, the assassins themselves reaped no glory from this influence. Their victories belonged to others, their sacrifices buried in anonymity. They saw monuments raised to kings whose thrones they had secured, heard songs sung of generals whose enemies they had quietly removed, and read prayers spoken for martyrs whose deaths they had ensured. For them, recognition was not only absent, it was forbidden. They had traded immortality for erasure, their lives swallowed so that others could shine. And yet, some part of them yearned to be remembered, even faintly, yearned for their silence to carry weight beyond utility. In secret, they found ways, a carved mark on a hidden wall, a scratched symbol on the underside of a bench in a cathedral, a stone laid deliberately among others in a garden path. To anyone else, these meant nothing. To them, it was enough. Proof that they had existed, however briefly. But most assassins left nothing at all. They faded like smoke, and smoke leaves no monument. In the centuries that followed, their presence dwindled into rumor, their existence debated by historians. Were they real? Were they stories told to frighten children? Were they agents of lords and kings, or phantoms of imagination? The truth, of course, lay somewhere in between, and perhaps that was fitting. For the assassin's greatest achievement was not a single death, but the mastery of doubt. Their legacy was uncertainty, a whisper that power was never secure, that safety was never certain, that even in locked chambers and guarded halls, shadows could slip through. It was this uncertainty that outlived them, more enduring than any dagger or oath. As the world moved on, their silence seeped into other forms, into spies, into secret councils, into the hidden machinery of politics. The assassin as a figure vanished, but the idea remained. that there are always unseen hands shaping the course of history. The guilds may be gone, but the silence they perfected still rules in corners where no light reaches. And so, when we reflect on their lives, it is not as heroes or villains, not as saints or demons, but as reminders. Reminders that history is never only what is written, that power is never only what is seen, that silence itself can shape the fate of nations. For silence is not empty. It is full of secrets, full of weight, full of lives erased but never fully forgotten. It lingers in the stones of ruined castles, in the damp air of crypts, in the unmarked graves that dot forgotten roadsides. It lingers in our imaginations, too, whenever we wonder about the stories between the lines of history. And perhaps that is where the assassins truly survive, not in records, but in our wondering. In the pause between words, in the questions left unanswered, in the shadows that flicker at the edge of thought. They live not as individuals, but as silence itself, the flicker of a candle, the echo of a step, the soft rush of breath in a corridor. All of these carry their memory, not as names, not as faces, but as presence. And maybe that is enough. Silence may have been their master, but in time it became their grave as well. Every assassin, no matter how skilled, met the same end, swallowed by stillness. Some were cut down mid-mission, their lives spilling onto stone floors where no one would speak their name. Others lived long enough to see their hands tremble, their eyes dim, their blades rust. And when they were gone, the world carried on as if they had never existed. This, more than death itself, was the assassin's burden. To know that their lives were meant to vanish without a trace. A soldier might die on a battlefield and be remembered for valor. A noble might perish in court and be mourned in poems. But the assassin, who had shaped both battlefields and courts in ways unseen, was erased from memory the moment their usefulness ended. Still, they carried on, because the work demanded it, because silence had bound them too tightly to resist, and perhaps, in the deepest parts of themselves, because some sliver of them believed their existence mattered, even if no one else would ever know. There were moments, fleeting and fragile, when they felt that belief stir. A successful mission that prevented a war, a secret past that spared a village from slaughter, a rival eliminated that allowed a fragile peace to endure a little longer. They did not expect thanks, nor recognition, but they told themselves that these small victories justified the weight of their lives, that even in silence, they had contributed something to the world. Yet silence is merciless. It does not allow for certainty. For every mission that seemed to preserve peace, another led to chaos. For every life spared, another was unjustly taken. The assassin's role was never about justice, only obedience. And so, many carried the ache of doubt with them to the end. Had they served good? Or had they only been instruments of cruelty disguised as necessity? These doubts were never spoken aloud. They were buried deep, carried in secret, carried in silence. But silence does not erase, it preserves. Within that stillness, every face, every whisper, every choice remained. And though no one else would ever know their stories, the assassins themselves carried them like stones in their hearts until the end of their days. When the guilds finally faded, when the orders dissolved into history, those who had survived long enough found themselves adrift. No masters to obey, no names to carry, no oaths to bind them. Freedom, for which so many had longed, came at last. But it felt like emptiness. They were shadows without walls to move within. blades without targets, silences without meaning. Some wandered aimlessly, drifting into monasteries or hermitages. Others tried to live as common folk, only to find that they no longer knew how. They had lived too long in shadows to endure the brightness of day. But a very few, found peace in obscurity. They embraced the erasure, the anonymity, the forgetting. They became part of the silence itself, melting into it willingly. These were the rare ones who no longer sought to be remembered, but instead accepted that to be forgotten was its own form of rest. And so their final days were quiet. They tended small gardens. They watched the changing of seasons. They let the silence that had once chained them become a companion instead. To those who lived nearby, they were simply nameless wanderers, strange but harmless. No one suspected that these quiet figures had once carried the weight of kings and kingdoms in their hands. No one knew that their silence was not born of ignorance, but of history too heavy to be spoken. Perhaps that is why their legacy endures in whispers, because deep down we sense that silence is never empty, that every pause in history, every unanswered question, every vanishing figure carries with it a story untold. And in imagining those stories, we keep their presence alive, even if we do not know their names. The assassin's life reminds us that history is not only what is written, but also what is hidden. That the quiet between events can be as powerful as the events themselves. That sometimes the greatest influence is carried not by the voices that shout, but by the silences that shape them. And in that way, though they have been forgotten, they have never truly disappeared. They live in the shadows of memory, in the quiet doubts of historians, in the restless imagination of storytellers. They live in every whisper that asks, what is missing? Who is unseen? What lies between the lines? The assassin's story is not a tale of triumph, nor of glory. It is a tale of weight, of burden, of silence that outlives sound. And as we listen to that silence, we cannot help but feel it pressing on us too, reminding us that we, like them, will one day be forgotten, that our names, our deeds, our voices will fade, and all that will remain is the silence we leave behind. Yet perhaps that is not cause for despair. Perhaps it is what makes life precious. The assassin's silence teaches us that existence is not measured only in remembrance, but in presence, in the moments lived, however fleeting, in the breaths taken, however unseen, in the choices made, however small. For even if forgotten, even if erased, those moments existed. They were real, and reality itself is a kind of permanence that silence cannot undo. And so, as the story of the assassin's wins toward its end, we are left not with names or monuments, but with silence. Heavy, unbroken, eternal silence. Yet within it, an echo stirs. The faint reminder that even in shadows, there was life. Even in erasure, there was presence. Even in silence, there was meaning. In the end, the assassin's story does not close with a cry, nor even with the whisper of steel. It closes with quiet, so deep, so complete, that it seems less like an ending than a return. A return to the silence from which they were taken as children, the silence that shaped them, the silence that claimed them. Their lives had always been lived between worlds, half in shadow, half in light. They were never truly of the villages that birthed them, nor of the palaces they haunted. They belonged only to the spaces between, to the pauses in conversation, to the moments when breath held and time seemed to stand still. And when death finally came, whether swift in a courtyard or slow in some forgotten hut, it was not a stranger. It was silence, at last come home. What remains of them now is not names, nor deeds, nor monuments. What remains is atmosphere, a weight in certain ruins, a hush in certain forests, a stillness in the corner of certain ancient halls. Walk there at dusk, and you may feel it. The press of presence unseen, the echo of footsteps that no longer sound, the breath of those who moved unseen and left no trace. History may have erased their details, but the air itself remembers. And so we come to the final truth, that the assassin's survival was never about the body, never about the guild, never about the blade. It was about silence itself. Silence was their weapon, their shield, their inheritance, their grave. Silence is the part of them that endures, long after the last name was spoken, long after the last guild was scattered, long after the last shadow faded. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it now, not as emptiness, but as fullness. The fullness of centuries of unspoken words, of unseen lives, of untold stories. It is a silence that hums, that vibrates, that carries the memory of all who were meant to be forgotten. Perhaps that is their final gift. Not fear, not violence, not secrecy, but awareness. Awareness of the unseen currents that shape our world. Awareness of the silences that define us as much as our voices do. Awareness that every life, however erased, leaves ripples. For what is history, if not a conversation between silence and sound? We know the kings because their names were carved into stone. We know the poets because their words were written onto parchment. But we also feel the weight of the nameless, the soldiers, the peasants, the wanderers, and yes, the assassins, whose lives were swallowed by silence. They remind us that history is not only what is told, but also what is hidden. And so, as we close their story, we do not honor them with names. We cannot. Those names are lost, scattered to centuries. We honor them instead with stillness, with the willingness to sit in quiet and feel the weight of all that was left unsaid. The fire burns low, the night grows deep, the world outside lies hushed as though listening. In this stillness, the assassins live again, not as figures of terror, nor as ghosts of legend, but as presences woven into silence itself. You can almost see them now, if you close your eyes. Cloaks brushing against stone, faces hidden beneath hoods, blades glinting for an instant, then vanishing into shadow. But if you look closer, beyond the weapon, beyond the mask, you will find something else. You will find a child, once given a new name, once taught to forget, once swallowed by silence, and yet still human, still alive, still reaching for something that could not be erased. And in seeing that, you see yourself. For we too live in silence more than we realize. The silence of our unspoken thoughts, the silence of our forgotten days, the silence that will one day take us when our names are no longer spoken. We are not so different from them. Shadows in our own way, moving between light and dark, leaving traces we cannot know. Perhaps that is why their story lingers. Not because of the blood they spilled, not because of the power they served, but because of the silence they became. In them, we glimpse our own fate. In them, we hear our own echo. And so the ending is not only theirs, it is ours. Listen. The silence deepens. The story fades. The shadows close. And within that silence, there is peace.